Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek Russian T34 85 medium tank. Since the last video update, the last of the tin work and fender work have been completed and fitted to this model. In this video, we're going to be going over all of this information. So if you're a fan of watching old school sheet metal work, then this is definitely going to be the video for you. Picking up exactly where we left off from the previous video takes us to the tin work, or the remainder of the tin work. So in the last video, I went ahead and mounted on the side skirt mounts, or I should say extended fenders. Yeah, these would be more or less extended fenders. And I said in the other video, the only thing that was left to be remaining were the rear and the front mud flaps. So the kit originally gives you these components made out of sheet metal. However, I figured that since I am going through some of the other modifications on the tin work, I might as well go ahead and swap them out outright. So I went ahead and fabbed up a new set of rear mud flaps right over here, and these are going to be done the old school way with using sheet metal. I just finished doing the mock-up work out of paper, so I have now templates in order to transfer these over onto metal. This is both done for the ones on the rear and the ones on the front, and I'll be going over that in a minute. However, it was really fun to bust out these old techniques that I had in my toolbox to go ahead and bring them on this model over here. This is something that I used to do more commonly on my older builds before 3D printing came out, and now these days I would just go ahead and whip these in 3D. However, for this build over here, the sheet metal is definitely going to be a smarter choice of materials. But either way, it was fun going ahead and dusting off these old techniques, and let's just say I definitely still got it. So these ones over here, you can see the template fabrication. This is just nothing more than printer paper. And the complex tools that were utilized was a square, a Crayola marker, and a scissor. That's literally it. That's and some scrap pieces of masking tape. I even recycled masking tape. I had some over here on the handle, and this was basically what I used to make the set that we have here. So this one here is definitely ready for transfer. Now, when it comes time for these parts, they do have to be a mirror image, and to do that, basically you draw one. You basically draw them on the sheet metal work, only when it comes time for bending, you just simply bend in the opposite direction, and huzzah, you have your mirror image. Another quick little metal tip for you guys. For the ones on the front, like I mentioned before, the kit does supply you with tin work, and here you can see the tin work that's kit supplied. However, like I stated in the other video, the tin work that's supplied with the, or I should say the front tin work that's supplied with the model, is what we would expect to see on a T34 76. Obviously, being a T34 85, it wasn't going to be suitable for this build, so that necessitated the need to replace them outright. Some people out there have cut these up and modified them where they salvage just this section over here. I was on the fence on doing that. That is a viable choice. However, the dimensions are slightly off, where the length kind of needs to be a certain size, or at least from the surviving T34s I've been seeing. And also, because I went with the ECA Tinwork mounts over here, the stock ones just weren't going to fit, so at that point they're just replace it altogether. So this one here also has the front section that is going to be hinged, and that's going to be functional. And when it comes to these T34 85s, I've seen two patterns out there. One that has the box style fenders that are non-hinged, and then later ones that are also hinged. Is this something that's a post-war upgrade? Hard to say. I have seen pictures of both, so again, it's a grab bag when it comes to these T34s. As for the geometry of the front tin work, this is very different compared to the original ones where we had this nice little bend over here. While on the later ones, it was just more boxy, which definitely more likely streamlined production and made it easier to crank these things out. If I go ahead and pluck this guy off of the model for now, you can see how the bends are going to go. Pay no attention to this guy over here. This is just a mishap, and I just simply cut a piece of paper and scotch taped it back in place, giving me the needed material. When it comes time for making templates, what a lot of people don't realize is that paper and sheet metal are basically interchangeable. So when you're designing things that need to be done in sheet metal, the old tried and true trick was to just make it out of paper first. You get kind of work the bugs out on the paper model, and then from there you just go ahead, trace, cut, and work from there. It's also funny when I see a lot of people out there, specifically I ran into this on the V100 build, where mostly in the Philippines it seems like, where they want to go ahead and get the template so that they could go ahead and make it in cardboard. And I just thought that was a really stupid idea, because honestly, for the amount of work it takes to cut something out on cardboard, you could easily transfer it onto metal, plastic, wood even, anything besides cardboard. Cardboard, honestly, is a crap material for models. I know I'm going to piss people off with that one, but yeah, you know, hard truths are definitely hard to swallow, but they need to be said. But back to this one over here. So you can see how everything is going to be laid out flat. I go ahead and cut it out, and then the bends are going to be done in the appropriate locations, giving you for the shape. As for the very front portion over here, that too has already been thoroughly laid out. And again, these guys here are going to be ready for the actual transfer work, which will be done first thing in the morning. Of course, after the templates are drawn out, some tracing with a Sharpie is in order, and from this point here, I could go ahead and cut these sections out of the sheet metal and start bending them and forming them to shape. Jumping to the front tin work, here you can see that the units have been bent to shape, and at this point here, I'm ready to solder on the hinge sections. The hinges are nothing more than just your standard hardware store small brass hinges. These things are very common to find, really plentiful, really affordable, and I've utilized these for many, many years on a large number of my 1/6 scale builds. Because the units are made out of brass, they solder extremely well, so obviously they are very adaptable for your 1/6 scale hinging situation. For the T34, the unit actually works out quite well, because in one single pack you get 4 hinges, which is literally enough to go ahead and give you just the right amount of hinges required for the tin work. Also, what's another happy accident is that you have, with the way the units are sized up, it is literally the exact same width of hinge that is required to get the piece fleshed out. Only on the real one, it is a continuous hinge and not a segmented hinge like we have here, but I'll circle back to that momentarily. And another thing is also the width of the hinge section is very close to what we see on the real unit, so these stock ones here from the hardware store work out perfectly. Before I do anything though, I do need to prep the surface. The first thing I need to do is to scuff up both the under areas of the hinge as well as the sections where the hinges need to be soldered to the galvanized sheet steel. This just ensures that the solder flows and latches onto these sections in a more firmer, tighter, stronger manner. By doing this, it makes the solder job go by not only easier, but when you're done, it's going to be much stronger in comparison. Also, on the brass hinges, even though they are brass, they do need some scoring and scuffing, because the units are actually coated with a varnish, and that thin little coat of varnish does wonders to prevent the stuff from oxidizing. However, if you're soldering, it's going to have a barrier, and the solder isn't going to stick to the material and just bead off. And here we have the sections with the scuffing added, and you can see it was added to both these areas here on the surface, as well as the inner and outer portion here of the hinge section itself. Soldering, as I stated before, is very similar to welding in many respects, where you have to scuff up the surface in order for some welds to work better, specifically if you're doing a V-cut and you want to get the bead to get in there. So in many respects, it's actually very, very similar between the two. But from here now, I'm actually ready to start soldering. So before you can solder anything, first you have to have the soldering iron really, really heated up. You also want to have the object away from a heatsink source. The metal needs to get nice and hot for that solder to melt and that molten metal to flow in exactly where it needs to be. And if you have a heatsink, it's going to draw heat out, and it's just not going to have some really good results. With the way the piece is, fortunately, again, it's just kind of advantageous, the portion that gets clamped into the vise is not anywhere close to the portion that needs to be soldered. So these guys here are actually just hanging off of the vise. And because of that, there's a lot, or I should say there's no real connection to the vise where it could draw out that heat and prevent the solder from flowing efficiently. The second thing is flux. Flux is probably the most important thing for soldering. Without the flux, the solder is just not going to flow that well, and it's just going to lead to some bad results. So for flux, I just use basic plumbing solder right here. It works fantastic, works great, and I also use it on electronics. I'm pretty sure some people are going to chime in on that one, but if it works, it works. For the solder itself, I like to again use 6040 rosin core. This is the thin stuff that you can see here, and this is for electronics. This stuff here I buy off of Amazon. Actually, I literally just bought this one because the last spool I had ran out, because I do a lot of soldering, and so I went ahead and restocked. I like the thin solder for doing my metal work because it allows me to precisely get into where it needs to go, and because it's so thin, it heats up very rapidly, flows even quicker, and it allows me to get the solder where it needs to go in a precise manner. When you're rolling with thicker solder, it tends to be a little less so because of the wider surface area of the solder itself. The iron right now is, I believe, thoroughly heated up. Oh yeah. Yeah, she's ready to roll. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a mask on because I really don't want to breathe in these fumes. Definitely not something you want to do. And then I could go ahead and start the soldering process. But before I do, I am just going to go ahead and smear some of the flux right here onto these two sections, like so. Also, one thing you need to know is that when you're done with the soldering, you need to thoroughly get these areas cleaned off. And this stuff here comes off with some mineral spirits or turpentine. It does a great job with getting rid of it. And then once you do, you want to get this thing into primer as fast as you can. Because of that scuffed up surface exposed to heat, it will develop surface rust. Nothing too egregious, but surface rust is something that can and will develop. And that's best thwarted by just getting the thing into primer as soon as possible. But say you don't get around to it, it's perfectly fine. Although there will be some slight surface rust on the area here, it's just superficial. You can just sand it down with some emery cloth and be done with it. As long as you get into primer in the after effect. But, so you're not exactly on the clock. Oh, as you can see, I went ahead and smeared the stuff on. I'll go ahead and smear the stuff onto the hinges themselves. Like that, and then I'm just going to line them up accordingly. When you're doing hinging like this and you have a row of segmented hinges, you want to make sure that they are all lined up as straight as humanly possible, because they need to function together, and if one of them is off, you're going to get some weird stuff going on. So I'm going to go ahead and move the camera, because the camera is actually in line of where I need to be to see if everything lines up. Okay then, so hopefully you get a good view of the show. Alright, I'm actually just going to go ahead and start with the first one. Once the first one's soldered on, I'm just going to add them individually, as opposed to trying to line them all up. Because they're individual, they have a really good propensity to move on you, specifically when the flux heats up and turns into a liquid. They're going to float and things are going to shift, and that's definitely not something you want. So I personally like to do it one at a time. Okay, so now that you know how the sausage is going to be made, I'm going to go ahead and mask up, because I don't want to breathe this crap in. Alright, so here we go. Okay, so the first hinge has been soldered in place. As you see, I like to go ahead and use the holes for fasteners as a convenient way to have an injection point for the molten solder to flow in and where it needs to go. Also, you'll see that I went ahead and temporarily jigged it with this alligator plier over here to make sure that this section of the hinge was flat against the piece of metal, just to prevent any sort of alignment issues. So now that the first hinge is installed, I am going to rinse, wash, repeat the entire thing until I finally have the entire row here lined up. So just a little bit extra flux again on the hinges, like so. You don't want too much flux, just enough to do the job. Okay, now I'm just going to basically line this guy up. See that he's all nice and squared away, and I'm going to first tack solder it in place. You'll notice I like to go one hole on one side, then the other hole on the opposite side on the reverse corner. This is a good way to tack it in place, and then from there I could go with the final solder bead. So this one here moved on me just slightly. get that set. Okay, now that's been tacked in place, I could go ahead and do the same thing to the one on the opposite side. Excellent. So, now that the piece is tacked on, I'm just going to go ahead and finish off the remainder of the soldering. The little bathtub here does a great job with getting the solder into place. And as you can see, when it heats up, the solder just pulls up and then it just goes naturally sucked into the long sections of the brass. Because it's scuffed up, it's going to just latch onto that in a very strong manner. Same thing here. Just going to let it sit and watch. See? Perfect. Let the solder oozing out from the side here. It's exactly what you want. Once it cools down, it's just going to grab onto that. You can also go ahead and add a little pool right here. Just so that I could go ahead and do the body work after the solder sets. This is old school 1/6 scale fabrication at its finest. Alright, so there's no point getting I'm just going to do the exact same procedure for the last two. No point getting that on camera. We'll cut across when that's already been completed. And here we have the hinge now fully soldered on. The solder's nice and dry, and you can see that the piece functions absolutely perfectly. I also went ahead and wiped the area down with this rag here with some mineral spirits on, just to get rid of the flux, as I mentioned before. And now that's taken care of, I can move on with the next step. So the next step is going to be to get rid of the extra solder on these sections over here, because they are unsightly. So you have two options. You can polish it down, well, I should say, yeah, but they both use the same tool, but either way, you could use the cutting stone over here to just go up and down these surfaces to remove the material and to flatten up the solder sections, making it as flush as possible. At that point, you can either leave it if it's nice and flush, or if you want to make it look all that much more cleaner, you could then take a strip of strip styrene and glue it on these sections over here, and this will give it the illusion that the piece is completely seamless. So I'm probably leaning on that just because it'll look nice and clean and crisp when I'm done with it, as opposed to the other way, which will work, but when you have a lot of them in a row like this, they tend to look better when you have the styrene going across. After I do that, well, not before, I'm not yet with the styrene, but once I'm done with the grinding, I'm also going to go ahead and solder on a little patch in this section over here just to give it that complete look. I have seen this on several real examples of T34s, and it is pretty crude, but again, that's not a bug, that's a feature on this pattern vehicle, and so it'll get rid of this gap over here, and it'll just make it look a bit more appropriate. And here's the exact same section of fender, but at this point here, this thing is done and it's ready for painting. Well, it's actually ready for fitting, which means I gotta drill some holes for fasteners, but aside from that, this thing is ready for painting. So since the previous scene, I went ahead and added the very last of the necessary details and then some to get the piece finalized. So the first thing I'm going to mention is with the hinge. Here you can see the hinge in its final form. As you can see, it is completely seamless. And the way I did on this one was a bit different compared to what I was mentioning before. I was mentioning before in the past I would glue plastic onto these sections over here, which would give you the same result. However, for this one, I went with steel. The reason why was, well, frankly, I was just out of plastic. But on top of that, it works probably better. I cut 2 sections of steel, same type of metal that's used on the remainder of the metalwork, ground them so they're nice and smooth, cut them to shape, and I simply just soldered them in. The solder was the same exact bead that's found on the end sections over here, which mimicked the real weld beads found on the real unit, and everything just came out to be perfect. Same thing here was also done to the one on the front. As you can see, I could open and close this thing without any sort of issues, and visually, the piece looks absolutely perfect. The next thing I went ahead and did was I added this little plate that we have over here on the mud flaps that have the hinge section. Obviously need a way to retain it in place unless this thing's going to flop around on you when the tank's in operation, which is something that's less than ideal. And the way the Russians went ahead and did this was in a very stereotypical Russian format, i.e. simple and very efficient. They simply just have this plate welded to this section of the flap. They have a hole drilled into this section over here, another hole drilled into this area where they line up, and a bolt that goes in unceremoniously keeps the thing pinned in place. Very efficient design, one that's really simple. But in order to do that, you need to have the plate. The plate, again, same exact little piece of steel, and I spot soldered it into these locations over here, which should keep it in place forevermore. The very last thing I needed to add was something that I figured my gut that this thing did have, but I omitted it for one reason or another. However, after looking at some pictures of these things online, yes, it should definitely have it, and that is the rigidity rib or flap that we have right here on the corner. So without this section over here, the tin work is actually fairly flimsy because of the width, and in order to make it nice and rigid, on the real unit, they would have this little section that would protrude outward from when the piece would be a flat, and then they would simply just bend it up 90 degrees, and this now would give you some rigidity on the metal over here, and it'll make it much more sturdier compared to if it was just left flat. This is something I missed on the original paper section, and again, it was just something that was bugging me. I figured it should have had it, but for one reason or another, I omitted it. But, you know, they always say, listen to your gut. So when I went ahead and saw that it had it, no big problem. I didn't have any tantrum or nothing, because it's a very simple fix. I went ahead and just cut a little piece of steel, and I simply just soldered it directly to the corner over here, and the trick was then to blend it in, make it nice and smooth. The solder joint was blended in as much as I can in this section over here with some sandpaper, and also this section here was blended in as well. In addition to that, I also added a small little radius sanding to this section, which will give the illusion that the piece was flat and then they bent it upward. And if you do that with sheet metal, of course, you're going to have a small little curvature or fillet like this section over here, and this is now present on this section. This will be much more appreciated after everything is fully painted. So that's all there remains to be left on this one. From this point, I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same procedures, but to the opposite side fender. No point getting that on camera, so let's cut across when this thing has already been primed, fitted, and we're basically installing it onto the tank. But before I go ahead and get everything into paint, I do want to mention the rear tin work. So the rear tin work has been completed as well, and here you get to see what the pieces look like before paint. The rear tin work is much more simplified compared to the front ones, as there's no hinge work or anything, but it does have some interesting quirks. So the first thing I want to mention is with this little section that we have here on the interior. You'll see that there's this bracket that's bolted to nothing, and that's there on purpose. On the real vehicle, there would be this bracket welded to the rear portion of the armor plate, and this would be the mounts where you would secure the rear tin work in its appropriate location. On the model, it's missing that, so rather than trying to fabricate a piece and have it bolt onto the model, instead of doing that, I went ahead and just have a faux section over here where it's just a piece of metal strip that's bolted on, so we have all of the appropriate detailing, and then once this thing is fitted in place, it's going to give the illusion that it has that little bit of detailing present. If anyone's wondering, yeah, but John, is that going to affect structural integrity? And the answer is no, because with the way this thing secures to the tank, it secures to the top portion here, to the corner section of the tin work, and it also secures to the side angle that is bolted directly to the armor plate itself. So with these two sections being firmly held on with fasteners, the two on top here are completely not necessary. Also, you can see that I went ahead and soldered on this little section of brass. This here is to give you that extender plate, and also on the real unit there would be this little plate, this with holes in it just like this to sandwich and to connect everything together. This is also true on the front sections, which are on the bottom. Yes, I'm going to fabricate those too. No, they are not on camera at the moment, but they will be seen in a moment. One last thing that I do want to mention before I get them into paint once and for all is to compare and contrast the front Tinwork with the original one. So here we have the original front Tinwork that was supplied with the model, and here you get to see what the exact same version, or I should say side, looks like, but as the later variant. So it's pretty cool to have them both in the white at this time. These ones here are going to slide off into prime and installation. This one here is just going to wind up in the bin of misfit parts. But till it does, get a good idea and appreciation for the craftsmanship that went into it. Alright, enough of that. Time to get these things painted. And with everything now in red, it just makes it all look that much more polished and finished. Not to mention factory made. So here goes the front Tinwork now. Looks excellent. And this thing will slide into installation, as will the rear sections that you see here. Oop. Unless I scratch the paint. But either way, these things now are ready for installation. Of course, all of that work would be for nothing if the parts were not fitted to the tank, and here we can see that they actually were. So starting with the rear Tinwork, you can see that they were just simply bolted on. Everything, both the front and the rear Tinwork, were all installed via the fasteners. And here, if I move the camera in closer, hopefully you get to see the fasteners in better light. As I mentioned before, the two in the middle here are just dummies, but these two here are the legit ones that are holding it to the fender work. If I go low, hopefully you can see the extender plate that I had to reference before. The reason why I had to make this adapter plate was because of the smaller fasteners that I used. For these ones, I actually used scale size fasteners, and because of that, the holes that were originally intended for the use of mounting on the fender were a bit larger, and because of that, the small fasteners would have just slipped right through. So I just used this steel strip here, drill 2 holes in it, and that acts more or less as a washer, and it makes everything fit accordingly. The real unit did utilize a procedure basically identical to this, so it's actually on brand to go with this type of method. On the reverse side, you get to see the details on the opposite side. These three are, again, holding it onto that brass angle that I mounted in the last video. If I pan the camera over, and the glare isn't in the way, you get to see how they are secured in place as well. For this, instead of using Loctite, I actually use thin super glue, which essentially does the same exact thing, and it's good for small fasteners like this. On the opposite side of the tank, the same exact system was utilized, giving you the exact same results. And sliding over to the front of the vehicle, you get to see how the front Tinwork was fitted as well. To secure the units in place, I utilize these two fasteners that we have here. These ones are the kit original, and the kit does have the front plate that is integrally drilled and tapped for the use of M3 fasteners. So I just marked the holes accordingly, drilled them out, and now I'm utilizing those to secure them to the model. One thing to note, though, is that the kit utilizes many more fasteners. There are 4 to secure the piece on. However, for a T34-85, they were only held on with 2, or at least from the examples that I was using for research. In addition to these 2 here that are mounting it directly to the front glacis plate, I have 2 more of these smaller scale ones that are anchoring it to the fender work, much along the lines of the ones on the rear. Just like with the ones on the rear, a adapter plate was fabricated for the exact same reasons. On the side section over here, we have 3 more mounting fasteners. Oop. Don't want to lose that. We have 3 more mounting fasteners, and these are secured to the 3D printed brace that I mentioned in the last video. Also, as I mentioned, the piece does have its fasteners integrally printed on, so this is actually a friction tight fit where the tolerances for the fasteners are so tight that you just press them in place, and then a small little drop of thin super glue is used to anchor them in fully. As you can see, the piece is actually held on in a very strong manner, and this should be more than capable of dealing with the rigors of RCUs. On that note over here, you can see that the front flaps are obviously fully functional, and they just flip right up. Obviously, if I want to anchor them in place or lock them in, that's what this little hole here is for, where I would take a fastener like this guy over here, slide him through, and bolt him in on the opposite side. However, even though the provisions are there, I'm not going to go ahead and actually do that, and there's a reason for that. One thing that I learned from driving King Tigers and Tiger 1s around is that when you have these RC tanks, there's always muck getting brought up and drug up by the tracks, and if you have an obstacle and it's going to hit the front mud flap over here, you want to have this thing loose, or what I mean by loose specifically is not anchored in place, because if it's anchored in place and if that object were to strike this section over here, it has the potential of just causing damage and or possibly breaking it, and that's something that you definitely want to avoid. But if the piece is hinged and the piece is not anchored in place, if some obstruction is being drugged up by the tracks and hits the piece, it's just going to flick it out of the way like you've seen here, and it's going to basically just spare from any type of potential damage. So that is one reason why I don't like to anchor mud flaps that are hinged on my 1/6 scale military vehicles, specifically my radio-controlled ones. However, the option is there in case the owner so chooses to do so. As you can see, it's locked in place with the fastener right here. There's no nut on the opposite end. I just slid the bolt in just to get an idea. And you just pull this guy out, and then the piece can hinge open accordingly. With the completion of the tin work, this actually marks a big change and step forward on the project. This was the last of the handmade sheet metal fabrication that needs to have been done on this model, and with this out of the way, the last of the model's details are at the moment being fleshed out and or manufactured. On the hull, there are some provisions and handles found on the sides of the armor plate as well as also on the front. I am in the process of getting those sanded down, sculpting them, and getting them ready for installation. But on top of that, I also have a large number of 3D printed parts that are finished with their research and development and are actually in fabrication. This project here, I should have the last of the CAD work done on it in about, I'd say, 2, maybe 3 weeks, if that. And then once the CAD work is done, I just gotta wait for the parts to come in. Once the parts come in, I could flesh out this model fully, and at that point here, this thing is, you guessed it, ready for painting. So this is a monumental step forward on this project. However, that information is best left up for another video for another day. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Russian T34 85 medium tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one here, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, not to mention photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel previously. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by EastCoastArmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.